Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier, and thank you again for stopping by. It's appreciated. I did an interview about President Obama's US-Africa summit with CCTV News. Do have a look at that. I sort of was talking about the Africa summit that's being proposed, about a semi-detached Obama in his first administration when it came to Africa, because of the need to be seen to be an American president and not an Afro-American president, especially as they were coming out of the recession, and saying that basically everybody's courting Africa at the moment, talking about hard and soft power, and that the U.S. retains hard power, a decisive hard power lever when it comes to matters of the continent, amongst other things. I'd like to thank the Bureau Chief of AP, Jason Strazuzio, for the time yesterday. We're trying to pull off a MindSpeak radio gig. And Jason and I paid a visit yesterday to Dr. Titus Naikuni of Kenya Airways. We thank him for the time he gave us yesterday. Of course, MindSpeak returns this Saturday, and our guest is going to be Dr. Titus Naikuni, the CEO of Kenya Airways. We serve breakfast from 9:30. We start at 10. MindSpeak is a free-to-attend forum. Titus Naikuni's CV, his name is Titus Tukero Naikuni, and of course he was part of the Dream Team, a permanent Secretary, Ministry of Information, Transport and Communication of the Government of Kenya, Managing Director of Magadi Soda Company Limited, Magadi Railway Company Limited, and also, obviously for the last 10 years, Group Managing Director of Kenya Airways. I'll put up a photograph of the Boeing 777, but of course everyone's looking forward to the Dreamliners coming, and I'll link to Jason's article once he publishes it. I wrote a piece on the 20th of January called Africa Correlations to Fed Reserve Taper. If you have a chance, do have a look at that link. It's on Rich Wrap-Ups. My home thoughts return to my mother, who I've been thinking about a great deal of late, and I pray that her soul rests in eternal peace. It takes me back. The photograph was when I was quite young, and it takes me back to one of my favourite poems, which is by Kabir. Between the poles of the conscious and the unconscious, there has the mind made a swing. Thereon hang all beings and all worlds, and that swing never ceases its sway. Millions of beings are there, the sun and the moon and their courses are there. Millions of ages pass, and the swing goes on. All swing, the sky and the earth and the air and the water. Returning back to that interview I did with CCTV, that was based on the news that President Obama is inviting 47 leaders to the US-Africa summit in August, and obviously seeking to widen US trade, development and security ties with an increasingly dynamic continent. Will send out invites to all African nations that are currently in good standing with the United States or are not suspended from the African Union. Clearly there will be no place for Egypt or Zimbabwe. Will hold talks on August 5 and 6. White House statement said the trip would advance the administration's focus on trade and investment in Africa and highlight America's commitment to Africa's security, its democratic development, and its people. This is not a zero-sum game. This is not the Cold War. You've got one global market, and if countries that are now entering into middle-income status see Africa as a big opportunity for them, that can potentially help Africa. At the same time, however, he cautioned that nations that simply saw Africa as a source of raw materials would not serve Africans well. And I covered all of this in that interview I did with Beatrice Marshall on CCTV. AbeShinzo is being quoted on the BBC saying the following. Volunteered that Japan's current bad relations with China are redolent of the relationship between Britain and Germany 100 years ago, or shortly before World War I. He recognizes, just like Britain and Germany in 1914, Japan and China are interdependent economies, trading partners with huge mutual interests. Explicit that he saw the 10% per annum increase in China's defense budget as a provocation. And saying that, basically Japan's title to the Senkaku Islands is unimpeachable, he said. Mr. Abe says he wants peace with China and fears there could be accidents that shatter it. I asked him if he had a roadmap or plan to de-escalate the tension, and he said not while China pursues its military build-up. In my opinion, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is the pivot to Asia's point man. The question remains around the leash and whether AbeShinzo is on one. The Chinese are testing the leash on a continuous basis. I wrote that piece on the 2nd of December about the pivot to Asia bearing its fangs. I said, then I see the pivot to Asia as the encirclement of China, then the shrinking of its operating theatre, and then lighting the tinderbox that is the periphery, and Xinjiang might well morph into China's Afghanistan. You will recall that the architect of Russia's defeat in Afghanistan was Zbigniew Brzezinski, and he remains a foreign policy eminence grise with the president's ear. The US probably feels it holds a decisive hard power advantage at this moment, and given that the trajectory is one of gradual erosion of that decisive advantage, leads me to the view that this pivot to Asia has a logic and momentum of its own. Therefore, I see the US being increasingly determined to press its advantage. One might even posit that calming down the Iranian front allows the US to better concentrate its energies on the pivot to Asia. One of the key elements of the pivot to Asia is the air-sea battle concept. This concept envisages the battle beginning with a blinding attack against Chinese anti-access facilities and incorporates distant blockade operations. China's dependence on foreign oil is increasing, just as the US's dependency is decreasing, and interestingly, given my belief that the eastern seaboard is a fabulous energy prize, that puts the Indian Ocean in many respects right into the geopolitical frame. If you are considering distant blockade operations, one of those areas you will be blockading is this part of the world, given the amount of energy that is likely to be sold from here into Asia in the future. I'll put up the snake, which for me symbolizes the pivot and the encirclement of China. I'll put up also a wanted poster for the Black Widow in Sochi. This is the Islamic threat about which we've spoken about before. Hassan Rouhani says no animosity lasts eternally. No friendship either lasts eternally. So we have to transform animosities into friendship. This effort is necessary to create confidence on both sides. Iran is in fact stretching out its hand in peace and friendship to all the countries in the world and wants friendly, good relations with all the countries in the world, he said. I wrote that piece of Barack Obama, Hassan Rouhani, the two Husseins, when I said the recent rapprochement is set to snap a losing sequence in US-Iran relations that goes back all the way to the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Furthermore, I said Hussein and Hassan are going to have to cut through a great deal of interference. In this situation, there are powerful vested interests fully invested in the status quo, referencing Israel and Saudi Arabia. There is a residual school of thought that the US is quite capable of finding two new national security partners, Iran in the Middle East and China in the East. I, for one, think that is a very tough call right now, but I think, the tectonic plates, geopolitical tectonic plates, are shifting. I'll put up a photograph that I like of Hassan Rouhani as it comes off his aeroplane. Nouriel Roubini tweeted 15 minutes ago that today has echoes of 1914, backlash against globalization, gilded age of inequality, rising geopolitical tensions, ignoring tail risks. Coming to the currency markets, the euro is at 135.49. Of course, the dollar touched 135.08 on Jan 20, which was the strongest level since November 25. Dollar index grinding higher, 81.20. Japanese yen, 104.33. The pound, 165.66. Climbed to 165.87, the highest level since January the 2nd. Aussie, 0.8807. Chinese economic data softened the Aussie. India rupee, 61.96. South Korean won, softer, 10.7404. Rial, 237.28. Egyptian pound, 696.09. And the rand now back at 10.92.15. The preliminary reading of 49.6 for a purchasing managers index released today by HSBC and Market Economics compares with a final figure of 50.5 in December and a 50.3 median estimate of 19 analysts in the Bloomberg poll. Sterling has gained 9.7% in the past year and is the best performer among 10 developed nation currencies tracked by Bloomberg. Euro has risen 6.3%, dollar 4.3%. I'll put up a 3-month chart of the dollar index. It continues to grind higher. Expectations remain that the Fed will cut QE3 by $10 billion at each meeting. We've got to keep an eye on that. Sterling, I'm going to put up a 1-year chart, 165.66. Unemployment fell to 7.1% in the 3 months through November, which was close to the threshold that the Bank of England said would trigger a review of borrowing costs. But the Bank of England has damped down those expectations. On the 12th of August, after I visited the UK, I wrote that how does an investor play this recovery? And I said you need to be net long sterling. Then I said I reckon there is an outside chance of UK property projected to rally 25% over 5 years, achieves that in 24 or 30 months. And I was saying I like looking for narratives that are embedded and entrenched, where I can see an inflection point. The United Kingdom, Europe and the US have inflected. Watch closely how the narrative starts changing. I refer you to the recent update by the IMF, amongst others. Euro dollar, I'll put up a 3-month chart of that, 133.80 last. 133.80 is my stop, 135.49 last. Interesting article in The Guardian about how some students or some researchers at Princeton University are comparing Facebook to the bubonic plague bacteria. Scientists argue that, like bubonic plague, Facebook will eventually die out. Facebook is spread like an infectious disease, but we are slowly becoming immune to its attractions, and the platform will be largely abandoned by 2017, say researchers at Princeton. Basically, they made this forecast by comparing the growth curve of epidemics to those of online social networks. Scientists argue that, like bubonic plague, Facebook will eventually die out. Ideas like diseases have been shown to spread infectiously between people before eventually dying out, and have been successfully described with epidemiological models, the authors claim in a paper entitled Epidemiological Modeling of Online Social Network Dynamics. Coming to the commodity markets, gold was last trading at 1232.80. I'm not buying into that. Excuse me, quite strong start we had at the beginning of the year. I'm expecting a $1,000 print at some point this year. Crude oil had a strong session overnight, 96.69 last. I remain of the view sell rallies, and if you get a chance to sell it above 100, that will surely be a gift. Reuters is reporting that Iran's oil sales are rising as sanctions pressure eases, and I think there is going to be a ton of Iranian oil snaking its way onto the market. Whether it comes through a swap with Russia, it's nevertheless coming. Be sure of that. And I said on that article about the two sayings that if the US and Iran were able to cut through the noise to the chase, WTI could trade as low as $75 a barrel. Venezuela devalued its currency for airline ticket purchases and foreign direct investment to halt a hemorrhaging of dollars that has pushed international reserves to a 2-year low. Venezuelans traveling abroad and foreigners sending remittances must use a secondary exchange rate determined at weekly auctions. The rate set at the latest auction was 11.36 bolivars per dollar, compared to the official rate of 6.3. Empresas Pola SA said it can't import more raw materials because authorities are delaying the release of dollars. Country's benchmark dollar bond due in 2027 fell to 69.93 cents on the dollar yesterday, and that bond has fallen 5% this year. Somebody saying the market has been hoping for a more clear-cut devaluation that showed the government is serious about addressing the increasingly acute macroeconomic imbalances. The implementation of a multi-tiered discretionary system has been difficult to decipher, especially with the government trying to emphasize that they are maintaining the 6.3 rate. Country's international reserves have fallen to $20.5 billion this month from more than $28 billion a year ago. Now listen to this, without access to dollars at the official rate, many companies and individuals turn to the illegal black market rate, where the bolivar weakened to about 79 per dollar yesterday. That's frightful. And we've got to keep an eye on that. That looks like it's getting very, very fragile. Sub-Saharan Africa, I wrote that piece about the taper and its effect on Africa. Now, I'll just read you a little bit. A lot of folks were predicting that Africa might turn out to be at the bleeding edge of the taper. Naturally, there were and still are concerns that the shock wave of the actual taper might therefore be a bleeding edge, slicing up peripheral assets in some kind of frenzied orgy of violence. A lot of folks were predicting that Africa might turn out to be at the bleeding edge of the taper. And I said, the defining characteristic of the two-year bull market phenomenon has been the increased allocation by international investors to African equities. The argument goes that these folks only got into Africa because they had 1.02 trillion of QE at their backs, and the moment that the escalator wind was not there, they would be hitting the exit button. I predict African equity markets will make it a 3-year bull year phenomenon. In particular, I feel that the international investor component invested in Africa Inc. remains a long way below benchmark, and that the move towards benchmark is a long way to go. It's a big macro structural thing. So I'll put up a link to an interview that the South Sudanese President Salva Kiir to an interview he gave to Al Jazeera, where he's saying UN staff are backing rebels. And I'll also put up a photograph of a picture of the leader on the glass of the VIP room at Juba Airport I took 1,514 days ago. France apparently is to up its African military presence. We are reorganizing our deployment in Africa to be more reactive about potential crises. We will have the same number of soldiers, 3,000 in the Sahel region, but they will be organized differently. We're going to reinforce Abidjan as an entry point, a logistical support post, and then we'll boost the intervention capacity on each of the different sites. Chad's capital will be a hub for French air power in the region and a base for Rafale and Mirage fighters. A site in Niamey, Niger's capital, will be equipped with an unmanned aircraft such as France's Harfang, and as of its first official flight on Monday, a US-made Reaper surveillance drone. So it's quite interesting, and that the French are now making sure that they have a landed hard power capacity in Africa. And then on that note, and probably taking cognizance of this, the Ugandan army has also set up a rapid response center. Colonel Felix Kulagike, political commissar for the Ugandan army, says the intention was for its forces to be a provider of peace in the region by deploying within 14 days to trouble hotspots. No other country has done what we've done in South Sudan, he told Uganda's Radio 1 station. In a few days we were on the ground to secure Juba Airport, and everybody else benefited from that deployment. That capability is what Africa has been lacking. He said the Rapid Response Center had been built so the region did not have to wait for Europe or the United States to do the deployment while Africans are dying. Paul Kagame has written an article in Huffington Post talking about ascending Africa. Women and youth are our assets. Economic growth is by its nature cyclical, but Africa is now on a sustained upward curve, is what he's saying. A number of other points. I totally agree with his point about women, and that's really something that I see as very basic. And I like this. His third point: in an increasingly connected world, we must recognize that information is the commodity of the future, and I couldn't agree with him more. He's making an interesting point in his last paragraph. The continent's increased confidence and hope in the future should serve to strengthen trust between governments and our citizens, and to build healthy international relationships where everybody's interests are represented. This should allow African nations to take more ownership and responsibility for ourselves. In doing so, we will maximize the possibility of falling prey to external dictates and ensure meaningful progress continues. Only this will give credence to the notion that this is indeed Africa's century. I'll put up a link for when President Kagame was my guest on Mindspeak, and a photograph of him and myself on that day. And just to mention in passing, he made some very aggressive comments about garbage, all kinds. The very next day, they flooded the Twitter feed with photographs of Rwandan soldiers boarding US aircraft planes to go to CAR to assist. And really, it's been a very 21st century communication strategy, and with the best in Africa, frankly. South African all share up 1.67%, and that's at an all-time high. Dollar versus rand, around the 1090 level. I'll put up a 1-month chart. And as I said on the 20th of January, if the taper turns helter-skelter, then the rand might even head to 12. And it's actually been a kind of global proxy for risk, and still is, and therefore remains at the bleeding edge of the taper. The biggest union in South Africa's platinum sector has called a strike over pay. This is the biggest in the sector since the 2012 Marikana massacre. I'll put up a 3-month chart of the jittering pound. I hear 5 soldiers or policemen have been shot. It remains volatile. The stock market, of course, is looking through the noise and is at 36-month highs, and the best performing stock index in Africa this year up 5.85%. I wrote on the 30th of December that Africa remains in a sweet spot, and as I said at the end of 2012, the rally has legs and further to go. The Nigerian all share is up 0.34% this year. Ghana Stock Exchange Composite Index is up 3.35% this year and at record all-time highs. However, Ghana's economic growth slowed sharply to 0.3% year-on-year in the third quarter of 2013 due to a slowdown in the mining sector, compared with 1.6% growth in the third quarter of 2012. Talking about gold prices falling, and also saying that the Jubilee field was not at full blast. Good luck, President Goodluck Jonathan at the World Economic Forum said security is key. If you cannot move freely, it will inhibit investment. Well, deserves a medal for that comment. And then Aliko Dangote saying, my vision for 2050, you need united Africa with a common market. Pirates have been suspected to have attacked a tanker off Angola. Fuel tank is suspected to have been hijacked by pirates off the coast of Angola. The ship's owner said on Wednesday in what would be the most southerly attack to date by pirates off West Africa. Congo oil may impose 40% tax and allow drilling in a gorilla park. This is highly unfortunate. There's so much policy volatility in Congo, which means that it's only the most brave folks who enter there, people like Dan Gertler, and if they get it right, they cream it. And I agree with this comment from Fleuret, which is his holding company. It is vital that the government of the DRC gets this important legislation right and introduces a regulatory framework which balances the need to create a positive, stable environment that encourages investment while ensuring Congolese citizens benefit. Coming to Kenya, interesting headline on Business Daily about how a battle for the insurance cash has stalled Westgate's business recovery. The story is saying that basically KCB was a lender. Insurance payment has come in, KCB have held on to it, and Westgate are complaining about that. I'll put up a photograph of Westgate on fire taken 121 days ago. And just mention security-related chatter is at post-Westgate highs. The best performing share at the NSE this year is BOC Kenya. That's up 34.4%. Safaricom closed at 12 yesterday, is plus 10.6% and at a record closing high. Kenya Re is up 25.48% and retreated yesterday, but it been setting a succession of all-time highs. I did an interview with CNBC where I said I expected the NSE to have a very strong January. That looks like it's being played out. The Nairobi All Share is up 4.45% this year. This is an all-time high. NSE 20 is up 3.35% in 2014, has closed above 5,000 since the 8th of January 2014. I'll put up a link where you can check any share price that you care to check. Remember, you can just register on the website and follow the live feed. And please remember, day after tomorrow, 9:30, we're serving breakfast at the Intercontinental, and our guest is going to be Dr. Titus Naikuni of Kenya Airways. We start at 10 a.m. Once again, thank you for taking the time to stop by.